These monitors obviously look very similar. Well, they have different stands, but apart from that, they look absolutely identical. And spec-wise, they're pretty much the same as well. Both are 24-inch IPS monitors with a refresh rate of 144 Hz. But they're actually marketed differently, one being a VG series monitor and part of the TUF brand, while the other one is a VP series monitor without any special branding. And of course, there is a price difference of roughly $30 between them. So let's dig a bit deeper to see what's the difference between those two Asus monitors. The monitor with that plain circular stand is the VP249QGR, which is gonna be the main focus of this video. The other one with the adjustable square stand may be familiar to you, as I already did a video on this. It's the VG249Q, which in contrast to the other monitor is distributed under the TUF gaming brand. TUF branding also means the VG model comes with TUF logos, with the cheaper VP model fortunately goes without. But it also goes without the fully adjustable stand. The circular stand with its glossy finish looks a bit outdated and feels a tad bit cheap, though I appreciate the lack of any logos. The stand also provides tilt adjustment, but height cannot be adjusted. For me, the panel position is roughly 2 to 3 cm too low, so I would recommend raising the monitor a bit to avoid neck pain. It's also possible to connect a fully adjustable stand to the VESA mount or attach the monitor to a wall mount. An aftermarket stand will of course add up to the price of the VP, so that you might just as well get the VG instead if you like the stand that it comes with. Just as the VG, the VP has a DisplayPort logo on the bottom bezel, but only comes with an HDMI cable included in the box. The box content might be different for other regions though. A look under the monitor reveals a pair of speakers. They sound significantly worse than what comes out of the VG249Q speakers though. But if you really care about good audio, there's no way around external speakers or headphones anyway, so the speaker quality shouldn't be a huge drawback in my opinion. Now, the menu navigation is done with buttons. I'm not a huge fan of that and prefer joystick navigation. Interestingly enough, the VP249QGR comes with an OSD menu that is slightly different from its sibling. What's called standard mode now seems to resemble the racing mode of the VG monitor. This is the most accurate mode and thus what I used for calibrating and measuring the display. Let's begin the measurement section with the usual macro shots of the panel. Text is rendered clear, and we can also see the anti-reflective coating and subpixel structure. There's nothing to complain about here, so moving on. The maximum brightness setting measures close to 300 candelas per square meter, which is a good bit more than the 250 candelas the monitor should have. Turning the brightness down to 0 leaves us with about 50 candelas per square meter, which is nice to see as this is pretty dim and great for using the monitor in a dark room. I want to quickly note here that these are more or less the same values I got for the VG249Q as well. Setting the brightness to 36 leads to about 140 candelas per square meter, which I use for calibration and as a common thread for comparing monitors. The corresponding black level is 0.14 candelas per square meter, which gives us a contrast ratio of 1024:1. That's among the best you can expect from an IPS panel without local dimming. And again, all these values are extremely close to the VG249Q. So let's take a look at the backlight uniformity. Make sure to watch this part in 4K if possible, as YouTube's compression will crush these images otherwise. Starting with a realistic exposure, we can see the very good backlight uniformity of the VP249QGR with only a small bright spot in the top right corner. The VG249Q is pretty much on par here. I also took photos with a much longer exposure. These pictures vastly exaggerate any non-uniformities and therefore are for comparison purposes only. Switching back to the VP249QGR, we get a slightly more even backlight. Also, we see that the spot in the top right corner indeed is a bit smaller. Keep in mind that those differences are extremely subtle in real-world situations. Even more, the backlight uniformity can vary highly across different copies of the same monitor, so please don't overestimate the meaning of those differences. A similar warning applies to the white uniformity. When showing a white picture, the dimmest spot could be found in the top left corner, being about 14% darker than in the middle of the screen. The average brightness deviation is roughly 8.5%. Overall, that's a decent result and on the edge of being perceivable by the human eye. That's more than good enough for general usage and even good for ambitious creative work. The VG249Q scored an even better result here, shaving off roughly 2 percentage points of the average and maximum brightness deviation. Now let's take a look at the VP249QGR's color performance after calibration and profiling. You can download the corresponding ICC profile from the link in the video description. Out of the box, the white point needed a small adjustment through the color sliders in the monitor's menu. Make sure to apply the same settings when using the ICC profile. And keep in mind that you need to calibrate your monitor individually for really accurate results. After a full calibration and profiling, the VP249QGR showed accurate colors with delta E values below 1 for the average and below 3 for the maximum. Now, its sibling measured smaller error values, though I would not consider that a meaningful difference, especially as delta E is below 3 for the maximum and below 1 for the average should even be accurate enough for most professional photographers. If you're editing photos for a living, you probably would want a bigger color gamut though. Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 are both below 80% covered. That's not a drawback if you're planning to use the monitor non-professionally, which I would assume with a monitor like this. The important sRGB color space is pretty much completely covered, so that should satisfy hobby photo or video editors who plan to publish the work online. The gamut volume is just 12% larger than sRGB, what's pretty handy to avoid oversaturation in non-color managed applications such as games. If you already watched my review of the VG249Q, those gamut values might be familiar to you as they're pretty much the same. Just as the VG, the VP provides an sRGB mode with the intention of delivering accurate sRGB performance with a claimed color gamut. And just like with the VG, this mode is not very accurate. It disables the brightness control and ruins the contrast ratio. So better avoid this mode as the oversaturation is not huge in the standard mode anyway. Now, the color gamut isn't particularly large, and the VP249QGR accepts 8 bits of color depth as an input. However, I do think those 8 bits are displayed as 6-bit plus FRC, as I could spot faint banding and extreme gradients. The same is true for the VG249Q, but this shouldn't be a drawback for most users, as most natural gradients in photos or videos are displayed without any issues. I'd consider the performance to be close to a real 8-bit panel. Let's move on to more gaming-related aspects. The VP249QGR of course packs a refresh rate of 144Hz, which is pretty much the standard for current gaming monitors. It also comes with adaptive sync support, namely FreeSync or G-Sync. Owners of an NVIDIA graphics card will need to get a DisplayPort cable separately to use G-Sync, as this does not work over the HDMI 1.4 input the monitor provides. This is unless you were lucky enough to receive a DisplayPort cable in the box, which you might depending on your region. Either way, AMD users get FreeSync support over both the HDMI and the DisplayPort connection. The monitor also is FreeSync Premium compatible. NVIDIA didn't validate the Asus is G-Sync compatible, so you have to manually enable G-Sync in the NVIDIA control panel. This isn't a problem at all, and G-Sync worked as intended in my testing. A good gaming experience also needs a monitor that delivers a sharp and crisp motion performance. As usual, I've used Blurbuster's pursuit camera technique to capture how the monitor handles things like ghosting and motion blur. Starting with the 144Hz pictures, we see a decent ghosting performance at the lowest overdrive setting. This probably is the native performance of the IPS panel without any overdrive. Asus calls their overdrive trace-free and provides a slider from 0 to 100 in increments of 20. The lower settings are pretty boring, so I'll skip them and go straight to the most extreme settings. With trace-free at 100, there still can be observed some mild ghosting at the trailing edge of the UFO. Overall, this is a good result for an affordable IPS monitor, and I much appreciate that Asus decided not to include a setting which ridiculously tuned up overdrive. Let's quickly confirm that trace-free at 100 is still usable when the refresh rate drops below 144Hz, which is expected when using adaptive sync. And there's still no inverse ghosting visible at 120Hz. In fact, I'd even say that the ghosting looks even better than at 144Hz. The overdrive seems to be an even better fit to the slightly lower refresh rate. So how does the 144Hz performance compare to the VG249Q? Well, the VG does deliver a superior ghosting performance at the maximum overdrive setting. This surely is not a night and day difference, but something you might care about if you're sensitive to ghosting. Despite all the speculations about these two monitors may be identical apart from their stand, they obviously differ in their response times. I suspect this is due to different overdrive implementations. Turning the VG's trace-free down to 80 gives us a pretty comparable result. So the VP249QGR's overdrive likely is kept at a lower setting than that of its sibling. Now the VP249QGR also sports backlight strobing, which Asus calls ELMB. This mode evidently does a great job eliminating the motion blur. Unfortunately, ELMB cannot be combined with Adaptive Sync or Overdrive. Without Overdrive, it isn't possible to get rid of the ghost images that are trailing behind the UFO. In addition to that, the brightness is now fixed at 161 candelas per square meter. Setting ELMB to turbo is even a bit more effective against motion blur, but sets the brightness to an even dimmer value. Considering the limitations of ELMB, I would not recommend either of the available modes and recommend using trace-free at 100 instead. Moving on to the 60Hz images, some console gamers will be happy to see the good ghosting performance this monitor delivers. There is no drawback in turning trace-free all the way up to 100 at this refresh rate, so the VP249QGR truly delivers a single overdrive setting that is good for all relevant refresh rates. This is a bit different with the VG249Q. Here the maximum overdrive introduces inverse ghosting at 60Hz, so in my review I recommend turning this down to 80 for 60Hz gaming. Interestingly enough, this produces virtually identical performance to the VP model at its maximum overdrive setting. This reaffirms my assumption that the maximum overdrive of the VP249QGR is equivalent to trace-free at 80 with the VG249Q. So who should buy the VP249QGR and who should invest in the slightly more expensive VG249Q? If you want an ergonomic stand, you obviously need to either buy the VG or go with the VP and an aftermarket stand. This will likely eat up the price difference, which is around $30 depending on your region, so in that case it's smart to go straight for the VG249Q. If you don't care about ergonomics or already got a mounting solution, it's compelling to go for the cheaper VP249QGR. And the performance of those two monitors is very similar in most aspects. I couldn't find reliable information on which panel models Asus builds into these monitors, but due to their similarities, I suspect they actually both use the same panel. Despite that, the results of the VP249QGR regarding contrast, white uniformity and color accuracy were a wee bit weaker than what the VG249Q delivered. This should not be overestimated, as this kind of variance could also boil down to panel manufacturing tolerances. So I would consider the performance regarding before-mentioned aspects as identical for practical use. However, if you allow me to speculate a bit, I can imagine that there's some kind of binning process involved with the slightly better panels getting built into the VG249Q. But this is really not possible to tell for sure from just one sample of each monitor, so it's just my guess. Despite these monitors being very similar, there's a difference when it comes to ghosting performance. At the maximum refresh rate, the more expensive VG249Q delivers the superior performance with less smearing. The VP249QGR still does good in that regard, but it can't keep up with its sibling that performs among the best IPS monitors. This is probably thanks to its more aggressively tuned overdrive, which is kept at weaker levels with the VP249QGR. So if you're gaming at high refresh rates and are sensitive to ghosting, the VG249Q is probably worth the price premium. However, things are a bit different if you're a console gamer and stuck with 60Hz. At this refresh rate, the VG249Q's overdrive needs to be turned down a step, which leaves us with the same performance of the cheaper VP249QGR at its maximum overdrive setting. I also want to quickly mention that I was told some people actually are successfully running the VG249Q at 120Hz from their Xboxes, despite only having an HDMI 1.4 input. The same thing should be possible with the VP249QGR as well. Now, despite being very similar monitors, the Asus VP249QGR is not identical to the VG249Q minus the stand. However, there's a spark of truth in those rumors. The overall image quality is close enough to be described as basically identical. But there's a meaningful difference when it comes to the ghosting performance. For some, this may be reason enough to spend a few dollars more for the TUF branded Asus. Others might not care about a bit more ghosting. Either way, both monitors perform great for their respective prices. They are pretty good choices for mixed usage profiles, including high refresh rate gaming, office and even some creative work, including photo and video editing. Also, check out my review of the VG249Q if you haven't already, and consider to subscribe.